The psychology of money as an entrepreneur. There's two distinct psychological stages of wealth creation that you need to navigate to ensure that you not only make the wealth, but you have the ability to hold on to it. I'm going to run you through those stages and give you a couple of examples of how you can equip yourself to ensure that you can create financial freedom for you and your family. So let's get stuck in. So up in Sydney at the moment, I'm trying to say down in Sydney, catching up with the team to do some team building stuff. Just went and got a fresh haircut. You can't see it under the hat, but I've decided to clean myself up so I'm not so scruffy, because I've been doing a lot of research into money psychology, the money mindset that ultimately keeps people where they are. And what's really interesting is that money, the more I learn about it and the more that I work with people, I realize that money is ultimately a game of psychology. And it's all about understanding how you can set yourself up to validate certain decisions and be able to accept the decisions that you make, as opposed to just trying to outsmart the system. Now, there are two very distinct phases that we work through with our clients. The first phase is making the wealth in the first place. The fundamental principle of being able to make wealth is not about knowing the most about money, knowing the most about investing, but it's about being able to accept and get comfortable with the decisions that you are making. I see very, very smart people try and outsmart the market by trying to work out when the market's going to correct, getting their timing perfectly, researching more than anybody else so they can have all of the knowledge and all of the information in order to make the best possible decisions. And being in this kind of position ultimately leads them astray. In contrast, individuals that aren't necessarily super financially smart, but just trust the process and consistently focus on making the right steps, taking the right actions, and ultimately amassing tremendous amounts of wealth. And we've got to realize that in this accumulation phase, we need to find ourselves in a range of luck and risk. Luck is always going to be an element of your wealth creation, because ultimately what the past has told us is that we don't necessarily know what the future is going to hold. And I'm sure you've heard it before, past results aren't indicative of future performance. And this just goes to show that just because things have happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to happen again in the future, particularly in the same way. For example, we've seen that over time, the time between recessions has become larger and larger. If we go back a couple of hundred years, recessions typically happened every couple of years, then it went to every 4 years, then to every 8 years. It's been now 12 years since the last significant recession. But what we've also realised is that recessions, because they are taking longer to unfold, they are more significant, more fierce as a result. So if you're timing and waiting for a recession because you're like, oh, well, there's typically been a recession one every 4 years, it's been 5 years since the last recession or whatever it might be, I'm just going to wait. Well, if that was your thought process from the GFC, you would have been sitting on the sidelines for basically 8 years as a result of waiting for time to repeat itself. So we've got to realize that there is always an element of luck, but we've also got to find ourselves not too close to the other end of the spectrum, which is risk. There is always going to be individuals who play their cards absolutely perfectly. Now, they do all of the right things, they make all of the right decisions, but unfortunately they find themselves on the wrong side of the equation and ultimately find themselves in a bad situation as a result of those decisions. Not of their own fault. There's nothing that they could have done that could have avoided it with the benefit of foresight. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that they're going to say, oh, maybe I should have made decisions differently. But common sense wouldn't have led them to make those decisions in the first place. And for this reason, we've got to accept that there is always going to be an element of risk, black swan events that are completely outside of our control. So how do we work within that? Well, it's about diversification, right? We don't want to have all of our eggs in one basket. We don't want to take so much risk as to put ourselves in a position whereby if we do find ourselves in that black swan situation, that we ultimately end up losing everything and we don't live to fight another day, so to speak. So I think the most important thing is about working on the mindset of acceptance, of making decisions, focusing on trying to increase the likelihood of being lucky, and ensuring that we're not so far in terms of towing the line of risk that we compromise our ability to bounce back from that situation. So that's our first stage. Now the second stage is distinctly different. When we're in a position when we have accumulated our wealth, we now need to become paranoid. And we now need to be really careful around resource guarding what we've worked so hard to build. Well, why is this? Because I've seen so many wealthy people. I've had clients who've had multi 8-figure exits from businesses, who've nearly sold their business for $100 million. And it seems like an infinite amount of means. But to be fair, I've worked with people that have had up to $100 million, and anywhere below that, you still have to be careful with the resources you've got available. You can't fly private jets and drive hypercars all of the time. There is a finite amount to those means. And the issue is that because those people have become confident and developed an ego and an identity around making that wealth in the first place, they can often feel invincible. And I've seen many of these people fall from grace and ultimately lose everything they've worked so hard to build, ending up back where they were. There is a famous saying in the world of money mindset that the situations you learn to survive, your survival ultimately depends upon. We can sometimes create this vicious cycle, this almost Groundhog Day, to send ourselves back to the position that we were because we subconsciously know that we can get ourselves back to where we are. And therefore, the kind of the thrill of the cycle is what perpetuates that situation. So we need to be very careful with those resources, and we need to be paranoid about making sure that those resources actually last until the intended goal, right? Whether that be the rest of your lifetime, whether that be leaving enough that you can create generational wealth. And this is very hard for many entrepreneurs because we are intrinsically manufacturers of wealth, right? We've created a business or we've seen an opportunity, we've jumped on it, and then ultimately we've ridden that wave to some level of success, whatever that success might be. And to shift into resource guarding is a very challenging mindset to adopt. We call this the kind of transition from being a performer or a kind of a conductor of the orchestra, so to speak, right? We're firstly a worker, we then become a player, then we then become a performer, we then become a conductor. But then the next shift is fundamentally different into a trustee. Because a trustee needs to be able to manage those assets and trust in their abilities to nurture those assets so they continue to provide value into the future. The problem is that many of us want to fall back into the performer or the conductor so we can continue to manufacture that wealth, and it can put us in a pretty dire situation. So I want you to think about this. If you're in the stage where you're trying to accumulate wealth, how do you find yourself in that spectrum between luck and risk? And once you get to a point of accumulating enough wealth, let's say it's $5 million in investment assets, how do you then make sure that you transition into being a little bit paranoid, ensuring that you can resource guard to not lose all of that wealth that you've worked so hard for? It's a seemingly nuanced consideration, but most people don't think about their wealth in this way. So I hope this adds value. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments.